is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to Homebrewed Christianity, where since the year of 2008, we've been bringing you some ideological goodness episodes, our conversations with scholars across the disciplines, so you can think, reflect, and wrestle with your own faith. And today, on the podcast for the very first time, is Freya Mathews, an emeritus professor of environmental philosophy and an author of a host of books, including For Love of Matter, a contemporary Panpsychism. And look, this is an amazing conversation. I was recommended For Love of Matter from Godehard Brunschrimp, who's been on the podcast before, German process philosopher and theologian. And he said, you got to check this book out. And what Freya Mathews does in this text is really challenge a host of different assumptions around the kind of modern science, modern philosophy, and the way we understand nature and the environment, and argues that the environmental crisis is really evidence for a bigger problem than just something we can technologically fix. That the way our science and economy and our engagement with the world and the way we understand nature, that it's generating these kind of problems. And what happens when we start to ask the question of our relationship with nature, the relationship of nature and consciousness, and all these kinds of panpsychist style questions again. In the conversation, you'll hear us kind of unpack some of those ideas, her own story as a philosopher, her own kind of religious engagement, and then we'll even talk about some of her more recent books. But honestly, it was a real honor to get to talk to her. Longtime fan, first time podcast, and in one of her most recent books is called The Tao of Civilization, a letter to China, which is a great place to start if you're new to her work. But it was a complete treat to get to talk to a legend you've only had a textual relationship for quite a while. Before we jump in, I want to give a couple shout-outs here. One, right now, we're about to kick off our online class this Lent with John Dominic Crossan on the historical Jesus. If you want to join that, and it's donation-based, anything between $0 and $1 million, go to crossanclass.com. And we're going to be digging into you guessed it, the historical Jesus and its relevance for today. There's not only a series of lectures that Crossan has available, but we're going to do a series of live streams as well. And friends like Diana Butler-Bass, Jennifer Garcia-Bashal, Brian Zahn, Brian McLaren will be joining in those. So come on, crossanclass.com. We just announced Theology Beer Camp for 2024, October 17th to 19th. Where is that? Where is it going down? Denver, Colorado. And if you go to theologybeer.camp, you can grab tickets. The pre-sale tickets are live. Before we do an announcement with all this going down and who's coming and blah, 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 blah. If you just know, I want to get a ticket, I want to get it the cheapest, I want to do it before it sells out, then go to theologybeer.camp and get ready for an amazing in-person gathering with hundreds of listeners just like yourself. All right? And last, I want to give a shout out to Ring Lake Ranch. Why? Well, Ring Lake Ranch is an ecumenical, theologically progressive retreat center offering 1- and 2-week retreats every summer with the mission of renewal in sacred wilderness. Now, the speakers lead evening sessions on a range of topics during the week, and days are open for hikes, horseback rides, canoeing, fishing, and relaxing in a beautiful wilderness landscape. I'm going to be there this summer in July, and as not just me, other weeks, Brian and Diana Bass will be there, Hebrew Bible scholar Joel Lamone, historian Ruby Lay, artist and writer Molly Crabapple, Gareth Higgins, he's been on the podcast before, musician David Lamont. I mean, it's not just each week there's a different person kind of facilitating the nerdy time to beautiful place and all that. You get to have communal meals with all those that are there, very rustic, private style cabins, and the rates are intentionally kept affordable to give everyone a chance to attend. Children under 12 attend for free. There's scholarships available, and their goal is that the people that want to be there can afford to attend and be there. So to check it out, go to ringlake.org. You'll notice I'm going to be there this summer, but plenty of other people as well. It's a beautiful place. Very excited to go, and my whole family's going. So there you go. Check it out, ringlake.org. Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and today I have the honor of talking with Freya Mathews, who is an amazing ecological philosopher, a panpsychist. Wrote one of my favorite books. Gudehard Brunstrup, who's been on the podcast before, said, "Trip, read For the Love of Matter," and I did, and here we are. And Freya, where are you currently?
Well, thank you for that, Trip, and thank you for having me here and being interested in my work, and for all that you do in the way of sharing philosophy and differing philosophical perspectives more widely. So I'm talking from Naarm, or otherwise known as Melbourne, in southeastern Australia, and I'd like to acknowledge that it's Wurundjeri country. The traditional owners are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to Wurundjeri elders, past, present, and emerging. Mm-hmm. So that's a custom we have here in Australia now at the beginning of many events and talks and such like, and such a lovely custom.
One of the things that I thought might be a fun way of starting, in a couple interviews of yours I heard, and then at the beginning, or For Love of Matter, you give a bit of your origin story of coming, right, to make this kind of ecological philosophy, this plea for panpsychism, describing these kind of two locations of your kind of coming of age and your spiritual life, both a bland experience in the church and this deep kind of animistic experience in nature, and particularly with horses and such. You know, a lot of times scholars that come on, I like to hear their origin story, and because you've told it a number of ways and such an exciting thing, I think it's a beautiful way of getting to know the beginning of someone that has spent their life so invested in developing a vision of the world where all life gets to thrive.
Yes, well, it's certainly, for me, the whole thing has been one continuous journey, really. My work has followed just like one continuous developmental trajectory from the beginning. So there was a very strong intuitive driver to my philosophical path. You know, I didn't just kind of stumble into philosophy and think, oh, this is interesting. You know, it was like I was really looking for something. And that something, I think, has its origins in childhood and in early experience that I had. You know, this is it's quite a common story amongst people who are deeply invested in and oriented to the natural world. I was lucky enough to grow up from the age of 7 in a rural area, just beyond suburbia. It was nothing very special. It was just like market gardens and a bit of bushland and racehorses and things. But we had a few acres, and I got to have a pony of my own, and that was just so foundational, really, to my whole life and outlook, because not only was it an opportunity to really get to know and bond with a big animal, but she took me out into the landscape, you know, and even as a small child, I was able to go safely into that landscape wherever I wanted. There weren't any other kids living around about. And so most of the time I was riding on my own in the country. And it just opened me to that country. You know, I was there just like a wide open little human psyche ready to be imprinted with all its little treasures and secrets. I always felt like I was discovering secrets because nobody was teaching me. But it was really that initial imprinting that happened in that way. And because riding on a horse is also opens up the country to you in a way that human modes of transport don't, you know, like different things are relevant, salient from horseback. And you can, like there are fences, but you can jump fences and you can go on private property and you can just, there are all kinds of things like logs. You're looking for logs that you can jump, you know, you're looking for nice juicy grasses that you can stop and let your pony have a feed. It's like you are looking from a non-human perspective, at least in part, at this country. And all the time you're in communion with a non-human other, very close, you know, bodily, corporeal communion. So I think that's what opened me up to this experience of I don't like the word wonder much, but I said, no, it's not so much the wonder, it's the companionability of the natural world. Because that was such a powerful, ongoing experience right at the center of my life as a kid. I was looking for some kind of cultural articulation of that in my very dull, sort of rather drab 1950s suburban, Australian culture, very anodyne kind of culture at the time. And there wasn't anything. I was going to Sunday school. My mother kind of went to church in a social way because that was the thing that people did in those days. And so my brother and I were sent to Sunday school, but there wasn't any kind of inkling of the kind of experience that I was having out in the landscape in Sunday school. And so that didn't really gel for me. And then at school, there wasn't anything in our education that answered to this experience or threw any light on this experience. And certainly when I came to study science, that didn't throw any light on it. So it was just like this mysterious thing that the culture didn't seem to share. And it wasn't until I got into my final year of school and high school and discovered Greek philosophy. I was doing Greek and Roman history, and I stumbled onto the pre-Socratic philosophers and the kinds of questions they asked about what is the nature of reality? What is the world made of? How did it originate? And they were giving answers to these questions that didn't fall clearly within religion, and it didn't fall clearly within science. And so it was like, these were the questions that, I was looking for. And I realized, there is a part of our culture that does deal with these questions. And that was philosophy. And so, that's how I got started into philosophy. But it was a very, very long journey from there to be able actually to pursue the kinds of metaphysical questions that I wanted to pursue, because metaphysics itself was off the agenda at that time in Anglo-American philosophy. Metaphysical questions like those grand questions, those foundational questions, they were kind of poo-pooed as being, delusional sort of questions, and you needed to break. They were either reducible to linguistic analysis of the relevant concepts, or they could be analyzed away, by way of logic and semantics. And so it was a long time before I got to ask those questions in the kind of way that I wanted to ask them.
Mm-hmm. And across your work, one of the things you have raised a number of times is, you mentioned there that science kind of de-animates the world and renders it lifeless matter, and then wants to control it and know it. The normal expressions of so many religions in the West kind of fit in that scientific worldview, or react against it, but still treat it as normative, where then the question of nature and things are sitting in the background, and humans and our business run on top of it. And also, I think there's a growing awareness that our economy has done something similar, that it's kind of internalized that operating system of a kind of reductive modernity. And now we're at a time where just to ask a philosophical question or just to raise a scientific one doesn't ultimately bring together with a kind of seriousness that we need, looking at the ecological crisis that's before us. And one of the things I really loved about For Love of Matter is it is this argument for panpsychism, but it doesn't do what boring or normal philosophy text does. It doesn't pretend it's speaking in a vacuum and only talking on a particular subject, because this subject's so connected to the challenges we face. You talk about that love of that kind of initial love of listening and learning nature with the horse of sorts. When did in your life this kind of philosophical quest that the pre-Socratics and such animate connect to our growing awareness of the ecological crisis that traditional philosophy and the normal forms of bifurcating nature and bifurcating disciplines, you didn't see that as a really viable response, and even problematic if we're wanting to address what's going on?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you asked that, because initially this interest in metaphysics, not that I had the word metaphysics, of course, for a long time, But the interest in those kinds of questions and the kind of enchantment that they induced, it was not, it didn't in no way arose from an environmental crisis, because there was no environmental crisis that we were aware of at the time. I suppose like the first major inkling I got of a way of answering these deep metaphysical questions about, you might call them cosmological questions, was when I discovered Spinoza in my second year at university. I was at the University of London then. And I hated the mid-century analytical philosophy that was being taught, and that was like being not just taught, but rigidly defended at the time, and it's what you had to do. But I had a beautiful tutor who saw my struggle and told me that she would take me back to the 17th century, because that's really where the action that I was looking for was happening, and so she took me back to the 17th century metaphysicians, Leibniz and Spinoza, and I spent a whole year just reading with her Leibniz and particularly Spinoza. And like Spinoza, it's interesting that we're conversing from a kind of religious background, because I often joke that when I read and began to understand Spinoza's great book, The Ethics, I got direct transmission from the text. I think that's actually might be more literally true than I first thought, because it is like if a young student, starting out in philosophy, gets to read a master text that actually speaks to the core intuition of that person, whether it's in metaphysics or some other area, what it is that is really driving this young person towards philosophy. If they're lucky enough to encounter such a text in their early years, I think that imprints itself on the brain and provides a kind of an articulation, but also a kind of a template for further thinking. So that is actually like direct transmission, and I think a text can do it. Anyway, that's
I really agree with you, because that was my experience when I fell in love with Alfred North Whitehead. I got called a process philosopher by a professor that thought he was taunting me. Didn't know what it was, went to the library, grabbed books, and a month later had read a lot of it and proceeded to occupy the position until I learned what concrescence was. And it was one of those where you're like, I don't know exactly what this means, but it is obsessed with the things I'm interested in. And I could not know I have no idea what it would be like to choose to live without knowing. And you just like, I'm going to spend some time with this thinker till they tell me what it is. I use that image of Jacob wrestling with the angel. It's like, I don't know what's going on. Jacob, in Genesis, the patriarch wrestles with an angel, and the angel's like, the sun's about to come up. You better let me go. He's like, I won't unless you bless me. And the angel like chops him, and he walks with a limp the rest of his life, but blesses him and gives him a new name. I always tell students, graduate students, I was like, you got to find the thinker that becomes the angel you wrestle with until you get karate chopped and have a new limp and a new name. And like, anytime you figure out who that person is, it says a lot. It's like the nerd version of your favorite Pokemon or whatever. It's like, it matches their personality, Dad.
Maybe that's the masculine version of it, because like I didn't get chopped by Spinoza, and I didn't really wrestle with Spinoza. I fell in love with Spinoza.
And was it like, how much did it take? Like, what was there a particular concept or moment where you felt traction that you didn't anticipate?
I can't remember. It's so long ago. I was like 20. And I could barely read philosophy at the time. I mean, the books were still just completely opaque to me. But I spent a lot of time with my tutor. We had one-to-one tutorials, and we had a cup of tea, and we'd go on all afternoon, once a week. And I would write essays for her once a week and then read them to her and discuss them with her. Like, from today's perspective, it seems like medieval that we did that we had that kind of opportunity. So we discussed it a lot, and I had to read commentaries on Spinoza because I couldn't understand the medieval kind of terminology. I mean, as you know, the Ethics is the most inaccessible text you can possibly find in philosophy. But this happened, and I fell in love with Spinoza, and that's the only reason I stayed in philosophy at that time. This is now in the late 60s in London and early 70s. And there's no way I would have stayed in analytical philosophy if that hadn't happened. So it was a bit of an angel. There was a bit of an angel coming into my path, at that particular moment. The thing about Spinoza, and I became a Spinozist, and so many other layers have been superimposed on that basic monistic template that Spinoza offers, but it is a psychophysical monism. The body's the material particulars, and the physical particulars that we see around us are modes of this indivisible, bounded unity. So that has provided a template, really, for all my subsequent work. But going back to the question about the relevance of environment to the metaphysics. So I wanted the metaphysics anyway. It wasn't about protecting the environment at that stage. It was more this articulation of and throwing light on my own experience of the natural world that the metaphysics was answering to. So I think if the environmental crisis had not happened, I might have been happy being a poet rather than a philosopher, because it wasn't that I particularly wanted to analyze these questions, but rather to kind of sing back to the world, But then following this kind of train of inquiry through these years as a student and a postgraduate, and having to approach questions of metaphysics from within the accepted philosophical frameworks, the analytical frameworks of that time, so like modal logic, semantics. The only way that you could pursue these kind of grand questions was through these the ontological foundations of certain logical formalisms or semantical theories. Going on that journey and getting out the other end and starting to teach philosophy, it took me into the 80s. And by that time, the environmental crisis was starting to become apparent. There were extinctions happening. There was pollution happening. Rachel Carson had written her book, and there was the beginning of an awareness of environmental crisis. And therefore, there was the beginning of a new environmental philosophy, discourse of environmental philosophy. And immediately, metaphysical questions under the kind of rubric of worldviews seemed relevant to environmental philosophy. Immediately there was an awareness that the way that we were looking at our world, really at a metaphysical level, that it was that underlay our relationship with the natural world, the way we treated the natural world across our civilization. So this was like a problem, a metaphysical problem at the root of modernity, a metaphysical problem at the root of Western civilization, at least under its scientific iteration. So those things came together, and I could see that I could both do metaphysics within the framework of environmental philosophy, and that metaphysics was incredibly important in relation to environmental philosophy. And I was starting to be alarmed too in the 80s about what was happening and starting to realize that things were unraveling, And so that's when the metaphysics and the environmentalism came together.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I'd love to hear is, in that time, as you are meeting, year after year with students, introducing them to these ideas, how did you come to describe in ways that maybe people didn't raise the question, could understand how modern science had reshaped our understanding of the world and then even the self, right? All of these kind of common assumptions that we just internalize culturally and project back into the world as if that's just how it is. What did you learn over time at trying to communicate the not so givenness of the modern Western worldview?
I think that I just started with an account of the mechanistic, materialist, Newtonian foundations of science, and pointed out that this was metaphysics, that yes, there were metrics and mathematics that rationalized this metaphysics, but that this was a metaphysical template, that this was a basic metaphysical theory about the nature of reality, and that there are other metaphysical theories, that you can understand the nature of reality differently. I mean, there are alternative constructs that might also be true, or that might have been displaced by that mechanistic materialist construct that portrays matter as atomistic and devoid of any inner animating principle, as brute and blind, and therefore as in itself there for us to use as we see fit, because it doesn't matter to itself. It's brute and blind, it's there to be just rearranged, really. I mean, if you just show the connection between a metaphysical template like that and the attitude of instrumentalism, I mean, most people just seem to understand that at a rational level. If you provide alternative metaphysical images of the world, so like in my first book, the Ecological Self, I started out by explaining that Newtonian paradigm and then contrasted it with a monistic paradigm where reality perhaps doesn't consist ultimately and fundamentally in an aggregate of units, particles, and can't be therefore, reduced down to these fundamental units, but is already a unity, an indivisible unity itself. And that, of course, is really referencing the Spinozist view that reality is one substance, and that the particulars that we observe around us, such as particles and forces, and the bodies made up of particles and forces, are just modes of that substance. They're like ripples in a fluid, or like waves on the ocean, and and then material particles are like little whirlpools on the surface, and then larger bodies are like larger, more organized standing waves or whirlpools. And then that within that paradigm, we are also just ripples, little whirlpools in the surface of that substance, that ocean. And therefore, we are part of its fabric. There is no separation between us and that larger unity. We are just a mode of that larger substance. And we have a certain distinctness from the rest because we're self-realizing systems. We resist causal inroads into our integrity. But that's just an organizational thing within this deeper substantival continuity. So at an ontological level, we are the universe, but that allows for this kind of relative individuation of particulars and also of selves, organisms, self-realizing systems. So if you're an holistic part, like a whole on within this greater whole, clearly your relationship with reality is completely different than if you're an aggregate of atoms, and a mere aggregate of atoms, and everything can be broken down into these discrete units, all of which are kind of logically separate from one another. Your relationship to that world, that atomistic world is a world out there. It truly is distinct from you. So an attitude of instrumentalism is not irrational, whereas it is irrational from the holistic point of view. From the holistic point of view, especially if you view that larger unity as a self-realizing system, which is therefore imbued with a kind of life force or will to self-realization, will to self-preservation, self-increase. If you understand yourself as part of the fabric of such a larger self-realizing system, then clearly you're already invested in the continued unfolding and the continued self-increase of that system. And you won't want to in any way undermine the self-organization of that system because you're a part of it. So if the students are willing to listen, you can set out those alternatives and just show that they're very different and they lead to very different orientations to reality, to the cosmos. Does that answer your question? You tried to, and they don't get it, or they just tune out, or what happens when you explain to them that, how deeply embedded this metaphysic is in not just classical science, the science of the 17th century and 18th century, but physics now. It's still like that. It's still divisional. It still operates by trying to break the physical existence down into particles and then quanta. Now it's trying to break down gravity. It's trying to quantize gravitation. It's trying to see space itself as granular. It's always pushing down towards this kind of particulate atomistic view of things. And I think that's just because it's mathematically driven, and you can count units, and therefore you can quantify them, and you can devise metrics. If reality is made up of discrete units, you can mathematicize it. But if it's not, and especially if that unity is has as its inner reality a dimension of mind, and therefore meaning, you can't quantize that. Meaning does not break down into units and aggregates. It can't be aggregated in the way that atoms can. So if there is meaning at the core of reality, because reality is a self-realizing system with a kind of a will to realize itself and to increase itself, it has a good, that is its good. It's a good that it's trying to achieve. Then that is meaning, and all meaning will flow from that, and you can't quantize that.
Look, that was beautiful. And this is kind of one of the things I took away from For Love of Matter, the book, is the role of the cosmos in your vision of panpsychism. And, there's a variety of them, and it's become more popular, over time recently. But, most of them agree and argue because the power gained through science by quantifying reality to control things, manipulate it, and understand was so effective that then that abstraction from the world, we then believed it is the world. This is all there is to reality. And so much of how that functions is like the scale of it, right? Like, a physicist deals here, a chemist deals here. And one of the things I loved about your proposal in the book, two of the pushbacks, one is, that doesn't even include the qualitative experiences of our existence. To put For Love of Matter as the title is already problematized, because then it's like, well, what is love and what does it have to do with matter? Maybe if the matter is part of somebody that you relate to or this kind of thing. And I think that proposal, that runs in different philosophies. You could see it in the Tao, you could see it in the Korah, in the Timaeus dialogue, or creativity in Whitehead, that notion of the universal collective, that any particular is connected to this, but none of it fulfills its full essence of such. It actually gives a way of introducing or giving metaphysical gumption to all the encounters we have that sees us, be it the experience of love with a partner, or holding a child for the first time, or riding a horse and jumping a log, and all those kinds of things. It goes well, is this part of reality? Is your own experience of existence part of reality to include in the story? What makes you distinct from everything that you're cutting yourself off from, that it doesn't have the psychological side for existence? In that kind of, you talk about how the universe, seeing the universe as having a cognitive unity with a self-realizing type of system of its own. I think that move, which isn't always the move of contemporary, especially analytical panpsychists, actually has a way of introducing a much more cohesive ethical and aesthetic vision into panpsychism than a lot of the other approaches. And I think that's why I found the text itself so beautiful. That's not even a question. It was just, you said a lot of things that reminded me of my favorite parts.
Well, thank you. Thank you for liking it. But I mean, that's For Love of Matter is 20 years ago that came out. And my thinking about that normative core of reality has developed since then, and that is probably one of the most important aspects of such a panpsychist view that I would emphasize now. And I describe it as, it's still that, sorry to introduce a term, but I love the term conativity, the conatus. I borrow that from Spinoza. Conatus in Latin means will, and Spinoza uses it to mean this will to self-realization and self-increase that is characteristic of organisms and other living systems. I think if you have a view of the cosmos at large as being a unity that is animated by a cosmocognitivity that seeks to realize itself. I mean, why else did it come into existence? It seeks to realize itself. There is something in it that is a force towards existence, If you accept that view of the cosmos, then there is an ought at the core of the is. There is a normative core to what is. And that, of course, goes like completely against the fact-value distinction on which science rests. So again, this is cutting right against the scientific view, which doesn't mean that it can't be made consistent with science, but it exceeds science in its metaphysical reach. Okay, so if we are modes of this self-realizing system, we are modes of this cosmocognitivity, and we have a kind of little finite relative cognitivity of our own because we're organisms. We're not just like, bits of stuff lying around. We are also like that cosmic system configured so as to maintain and increase our own self-organization. If that's the scenario, if we're part of the cosmocognitivity and our own cognitivity is a kind of mode of that, then, it's in our interest. It's only rational for us to try to find out how that cosmocognitivity unfolds. Is there a logic to its unfolding? And I think there is. And that's what I've worked on, in more recent work, like my new book on the Tao of civilization. I would argue that we can find a logic of unfolding, particularly the clue is in ecology, and that this logic, it's the conatus, the cognitivity, like living things, they exist to realize themselves. That is like their prime task in life. We should not resile from that. We should not resile from ego, that is what we're organized to do, to maintain and increase our own existence. But when you look at the way the living world is organized, you see that there is a logic to how organisms do this. And that is a logic of, I describe it as accommodation and least resistance. That in an ecosystem, an organism that is an ecosystem engineer, its primary task is to create the conditions for its own existence. But it does that by accommodating the organisms and systems around it as much as possible, as much as is consistent with its own continued flourishing. So it takes whatever is on offer in its own immediate environment, what other organisms and systems can kind of freely offer it, rather than desiring the more inaccessible resources. It makes do with the resources that are on hand. So it adapts its desires to what is available. And it, in making use of those affordances of the environment, tries to make use of them in a way that will benefit the organisms and systems that are providing those affordances. So it's this recursive thing that you try to want only what the other elements of your system need you to want. And you don't oppose the other elements or players in that system. You try not to oppose them if that's at all consistent with your own cognitivity, your own self-preservation and increase. So you're like a martial artist. You're trying to conserve your energy by not opposing others unnecessarily and by interacting with them in ways that give back resources to them. So my favorite example of this is like there's a little marsupial here in Australia called a bettong, tiny little kind of kangaroo-like critter. And it loves to dig for tubers and truffles. It loves to dig for truffles in the woodland that is its habitat. And by digging for truffles, it disturbs the soil, the woodland soils, in just the way that the soil needs for its continued reconditioning. It aerates the soil. It turns it over in ways that make it easier for seeds to germinate in the soil, and it creates little depressions for water to settle into the soil, rainfall to settle into the soil, and so on. So the bettong just wants truffles, but the activities that enable it to find the truffles provide the woodland with an absolutely essential service. So if the bettong didn't want truffles, but decided that it wanted like ice cream or something instead, all of that would break down. The bettong's desires are adapted to the desires and needs of everything around it in its habitat. So that seems to me like that's a logic. It's like you can persevere in your existence if you do so in a way that conserves your energy to the greatest possible degree. And this mode of accommodation is the best way of conserving your energy so that you've got plenty of energy to invest in your further activities of self-maintenance and self-increase. So I think there is a logic to the way this larger self-realizing system unfolds. Connectivity and accommodation and least resistance, you could characterize those as a kind of law of this larger system. And when you look around, you see that organisms generally follow this law. If they're a mutation and they don't follow it, well, they're pretty likely to be selected out of existence because they'll be exhausting themselves. They'll be, resisting, putting up resistance, trying to impose their will on others and exhausting themselves in the process. And they won't be supporting the organisms and systems that are necessary to provide their habitat and so on. So that's a logic, and we might call that law. It's the law with a capital L. It's the law of this larger unfolding, and it's our job to discover this law and to align with it if we want the whole thing to keep unfolding, towards self-preservation and increase.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think that it's so crucial that we rediscover this normativity at the core of reality. I mean, we in the West find ways of rediscovering this law at the core of things, and that we can see this law very clearly, in Indigenous societies. I mean, I'm very deeply interested, of course, here in Australia in Aboriginal thinking, and that account of the law that I gave in terms of connectivity and accommodation and least resistance. And that accords very well with the sort of the basic core of what Aboriginal people here do call law with a capital L. The source of the law is in the land. The law is ontological. It's immanent in reality. It's not just something that humans construct and impose. So this way of characterizing law seems to be consistent with the core principles of Aboriginal law here. And also I look at Taoism in China quite a lot, and I think it's very consistent with the principle of Wu Wei in Taoism, which is also a path of least resistance. And that's not accidental because, Taoism is the kind of the indigenous tradition of China. And I think it does stem from pre-agrarian China. It does have like pre-agrarian roots. It's a carryover from the pre-agrarian history of China. Not many civilizations have that pre-agrarian carryover, but there was great continuity in China throughout the Neolithic. And I think that you can trace the sort of what became Taoism to understanding of a normative core to reality, a kind of logical or metaphysical way of unfolding that is intrinsic to things and that we can deviate from because we have this reflexivity that many other, species don't have. So we can choose to deviate from like the instinctual pathways that have been laid down in us by evolution. But when we do, things will fall apart.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things in your recent work is it begins right addressing China specifically and picking up right on this kind of pre-agricultural revolution, the wisdom that's there in Taoist tradition. But then you talk about civilization, the Tao of civilization, and so often civilization is tied to domination systems, tied to imperial projects in the East and West. And most recently, when thinking about the ecological crisis, it's tied to a kind of economic domination system. The civilization is built on an economic system that kind of requires constant growth and acceleration and all these kinds of things. Could you lay out some of the features that our civilization sees as required that you ultimately you are pushing back against, going, no, it's not listening to actually the law of the cosmos. It's not listening to how life has emerged on our planet and how it's flourished. Like, what are the things that, if we don't take seriously as problems and continue to treat as normative, set a death sentence for all sorts of our neighbors and also our non-human neighbors?
Well, I guess the notion of civilization has been traditionally tied to agrarian societies, like civilization emerged with agrarianism because that's when societies became sedentary, and because they were attending to crops, and they became stratified, socially stratified, and there was the production of wealth and specialization of labor within such societies. And before long, there was hierarchy and rulers and law of war. And so we have in literature on civilization, we've traditionally traced civilization to the Neolithic and the agricultural revolution. But part of that development into agrarian societies has involved production, means of production, and the production not only of crops and domestic animals like foodstuffs that are produced rather than hunted and gathered, but the production of artifacts, more and more and more and more artifacts and commodities. There's been a great separation that's occurred between the sphere of human life and dwelling and a backgrounded sphere of nature. Like the sphere of human dwelling has become increasingly artifactual, and nature is just off in the background, and like the ecological principles of nature people are no longer implicated in them because they're growing their own crops and they're domesticating their animals and they're building their own environments. They're building everything for themselves from scratch, as it were. They're no longer inhabiting nature. Our concept of civilization has come to mean stuff, basically, like artifacts and wealth and buildings and cathedrals and art and treasures and, stuff. More and more and more and more stuff and more sophisticated stuff. And so the stuff becomes technology, and technology generates more stuff and more stuff and more stuff. And now the background of nature is receding and receding and receding. So I think that is, if there is a law at the core of reality, and that law is about accommodation and there's resistance and whatnot, clearly this is going in the wrong direction. Like, this accumulation of clutter and stuff, human-made stuff, it's just going in the wrong direction. So there is a kind of prescriptive loading on the term civilization, isn't there? It's like, it's good to be civilized and it's bad to be savage and barbaric and not civilized. But if we want to keep that loading, then we have to completely reconceive civilization, because actually the value loading on the notion of civilization is becoming increasingly negative. It's taking us towards ruination. I hate to say this because it's not like, it's so counterintuitive, but I think that in order to have a kind of vision of what true civilization in the prescriptive sense might look like, is that we need to see how we could try to reapply those principles from indigenous societies in our world. And that would mean getting less and less and less stuff. But at the same time, not just tightening and tightening and tightening our belts, as it were, and doing with less and less, but trying to reconfigure our praxis, that is our basic modes of making our material livelihood, our sort of economic processes, trying to reconfigure those in terms of our ecological and other earth forms of knowledge. So, the way Indigenous societies, very much so here in Australia, they used fire was their major technology. But of course, it didn't involve anything but just a fire stick. And it was a way of managing the landscape that was conducive to increased biodiversity, but also conducive to sustaining the species that Aboriginal people favoured for their own livelihood. So it had large-scale effects on the landscape, but they were positive ecologically and positive for Aboriginal societies. And it didn't involve any artifacts. It just involved incredibly sophisticated knowledge, close-grained knowledge of ecology, the local ecology, and a rapport with the land and a feeling for the land, so that you would feel like they would feel what was going on. They would feel what was going on with the fire and with whatever their intervention was. They would feel that viscerally because their knowledge was so intimate of this environment. There's a thing these days called nature-based solutions to problems. I see that as something towards which we can aim in a more wholesale way, nature-led approaches to not only solving our problems, but sustaining ourselves indefinitely into the future, like a nature-led praxis. You would be aware of some of these kind of nature-based approaches to, say, climate change and to food provision. They're at the easy end of trying to convert our praxis to a nature-led praxis. So a nature-led approach to climate change, there are a number of examples of this. Maybe I'll go with the kelp example. So there's been a study that has shown how if you reforested 10% of the oceans with kelp, you would draw down, I can't remember the figures, but an absolutely massive amount of carbon. And in the process, you would also be able to provide enough seafood to sustain like 10 billion people on Earth every year, like 200 kilograms of seafood per person per year, something like that. And you would, at the same time, you would be in the environment of the kelp. The waters around the kelp forests would become de-acidified. So the crustaceans would no longer be suffering from the dissolution of their shells. And the kelp would provide habitat for a huge amount of new biodiversity just by this very simple operation, relatively simple operation involving very little technology. I think that is a really good example of a nature-led approach, just by way of some small intervention in existing ecosystems, relatively small in the sense of light on technology intervention, but informed with a high degree of understanding of the ecology of these systems, and letting the kind of the grunt work of this effort be done by nature itself. In this way, you would go a long way towards mitigating climate change, and you would be providing an enormous amount of foodstuff for the world's population, and you would be remediating the ocean environment to a very, very significant degree. So that's an example of a nature-led approach to our praxis.
It's so different than the kind of thinking that modern scientific thinking connected with contemporary market economies creates, where it's like, oh, well, let's harvest natural resources, let's burn down a field, and then we'll know what to do here. We'll use chemicals and try to control everything for the right situation for a single species to grow in a field. Or let's put animals in inhumane context and then try to treat them as if they have no internal subjectivity and all these kinds of things. That a lot of times I think we are sold a story that there isn't a law or rhythm, habits of relationality that can lead to flourishing, and that our only solution is one we generate to a problem that we've generated thinking that same way.
Yeah, that's right. And it's like our approach is to, if we have a need or a desire or a problem, we start with a tabula rasa, and then we build or make the solution. Like we just don't think of how we might elicit the solution through benign intervention in what's already there. That is how I understand what we might aspire to when we're thinking about ecological civilization. It's kind of pulling back from the whole trajectory of civilization since the Neolithic and putting progressively in its place, or reestablishing, natural systems in the place of these built commodity, artifactual, technological systems. I can see ways in which this can be achieved in relation to climate change, in relation to food provision. There are quite a few examples of people doing what they call extensive farming as opposed to intensive farming, where they intervene in marshlands or estuaries or something to re-establish wetlands, and then once the ecosystem is re-established, it does the work, and they just harvest. But they harvest in ways that contribute back into the system rather than taking it all. It's relatively straightforward to see how you could take a nature-led approach to food provision. Even building, you can see possibilities in relation to architecture, where, you might build in bamboo, for instance, or you might use local living resources to build in new ways. And in doing so, you might feed back services to the ecosystems which are giving you those resources. I mean, it's not inconceivable how you might do that with building. It gets to be more inconceivable how you might do that with, all the clutter that fills up our houses and like our kettles and toasters and our books and our computers and, our airplanes. It gets harder to see how you can take a nature-led approach to providing the amenities that all these commodities do provide. So I can't see that yet, but I think we can see how to begin that process at the easy end of this new strategy or new approach to praxis. And perhaps starting at that end, we will start to change, once we start to change our relationship with the ecologies around us, then perhaps we will start to change and we will no longer want or need so many commodities, that we will start to find meaning, in other things, in landscape and our relation to the landscape and our increasing knowledge of it and relationship with it and the rewards that come from that. People in modern societies tend to be unaware of the enormous rewards and forms of fulfillment that come from relationship with this larger system. So we can only start.
Well, I think that's a beautiful invitation. And for people that want to learn more, they can definitely go check out your newest book, which I will put links to on the page for this, but also Freya has a website, which is freyamatthews.net, where you'll find links and all sorts of other goodies. Mathews, no, only one T, not two. It's important. Otherwise, me telling you on an audio format won't help, but there'll be a link to that too on the blog post that's attached to this episode. I've really enjoyed getting to meet you digitally and getting to hear some of the wisdom firsthand. It's been quite enjoyable.
Thank you, Trip. It's been very enjoyable to meet you, and thank you for your interest in what I'm doing and for sharing it more widely.
Oh, no problem. It's been a real treat. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you for making it all the way through this podcast. Don't forget to check out Freya's books. They're all linked here on the post for this podcast. And if you dig this and want to keep making something like this available for all the people, then consider joining the Homebrewed community at homebrewedcommunity.com. And guess what? Not only will you help make this available and sustainable, but you'll get access to a members-only podcast feed. There's all sorts of little perks, and you can go to bed going, I'm helping bringing ideological nerdy goodness to the masses. Smoochy boochies, peeps.